Okay, so what we did there is I had filled the whole board, and we were getting close to our increments. We're going to try to break the lectures up into like between 15 and 20 minutes, and that way we'll be able to measure out 50 minutes better, so it's not a massive download that has to be done. It's going to be a little bit easier. So I think that one we cut a little short, but that's okay. It was good to be able to get the entire board. So I did a board clear, and all I've done is brought over kind of that last formula we had, saying here's the inflation rate. I'm going to use the CPI values. So CPI2 minus CPI1 over CPI1 times 100. And then I just actually went and made a little chart here. Year 1, 2, 3, 4. These are actually real values from the Fred site for CPIs. I don't remember what years they actually were, but we're going to look at the data here in just one moment. So I've got year 1, 2, 3, 4, CPI value of 188.9, 195.3, 199.7, and 196.7. And now, given this information, we can calculate inflation rates using the CPI. So first of all, just like every other growth rate formula that we've done, because I have to have a prior observation, I cannot do in year 1. You will notice I don't have base year on here anywhere. That's fine. We do not need the base year to find the inflation rate. We did need it to find the CPI. So there was a base year calculation somewhere that was done to get these CPI values, but we don't need to know anything about the base year to find the inflation rate. We just need to compare 2 years back to back. So since I don't have 2 years here in year 1, I can't do it for the first year. I think all semester we've kind of just done like NA for that, and that's fine. That's what I'll do right there. Once we get to year 2, I do now have 2 years of comparison. So I'd be able to find the inflation rate from 1 to 2 using my formula. So the CPI new, 195.3 minus the prior CPI, 188.9, divided by that prior 188.9 times 100. And whenever you calculate all of that out, you get, oh goodness, 3.4%. So the inflation rate as we went to year 2, typically they'll phrase it as year 2's inflation rate. So that's kind of how they're going to do it. But the inflation rate going into year 2 here was 3.4%. And again, just kind of flash back to the last video. That doesn't mean that everything went up 3%, but in general, prices are 3% higher. Okay, so if we kind of apply that same logic to the rest of our chart here, we could build this out and we would say, okay, now this is a continual rolling list, just like it was with real GDP. Now I have 199.7 as my new, 195.3 is my prior. So I'll find the change in those two values, then divide it by my prior value of 195.3 times 100, and in this case, I have oh gosh, my notes are small, and it looks like I wrote 2.3%. And then as we go in here to year 4, now something interesting is happening here in this case. You'll notice that my CPI value has actually gone down. That's telling me that prices have fallen. And you'll see whenever I calculate this out, again, using my same formula, my new value, 196.7, minus my prior, 199.7, over 199.7. I'm actually going to get a negative value here. So I end up getting negative, looks like negative 1. Oh, goodness. Doing everything real small, not great. Negative 1.4%. So this negative actually means something. This, in fact, actually we can see several different things from our chart here. This negative means we had what we call deflation. A negative inflation rate means there was deflation in the economy. Deflation is a decrease in the general level of prices. Deflation is a decrease in the general level of prices. Deflation is actually kind of rare, especially if you look at annual, like which, year 1, year 2, year 3. Deflation is kind of rare. We really just don't see it too frequently. And we'll put the data up here in just a second. You'll be able to see that. If we look at it monthly, it's a little more common because you have a lot more observations. But annually, I think we really only have 3 annual observations. It'll be interesting to see what happens this year, because we actually were predicted to have about 2 or 3% inflation before all of the coronavirus. And since a lot of the CPI, again, the CPI basket at least is gas, every consumer is purchasing gas and that price is tanked, it might be interesting. It might be enough to actually drive down prices enough where maybe we don't get that 2 or 3%. Maybe it gets closer to 1, maybe it gets closer to 0. I don't quite think we'll get negative this year. We were close a year or 2 ago. I don't quite think we'll get to negative. That's a pretty big drop, but I guess it's possible depending on how long all of the quarantining goes on. Not only are we not spending money on gas, but we're not spending money on restaurants. We're not spending money on maybe entertainment. So effectively, those prices now are falling dramatically. They might be falling to 0 in some cases. So maybe possible for deflation this year, but probably still not. So deflation, not super common. We're also noticing another thing in this little chart that's occurring right here between years 2 and years 3. What we have here is called disinflation. Disinflation occurs when the inflation rate is positive but falling. When the inflation rate is positive but falling. And the reason I show the whole chart here is because I think you can really see the disinflation really well here. So in year 2, what did we say happened? We said, well, we had inflation. Prices are 3.4% higher than they were last year. In year 3, we had inflation. Prices are 2.3% higher than they were last year. And you can see that in our CPI because our CPI went up. Prices are still going up during disinflation. They're just not going up at the same rate. They're going up slower. So if you remember when we talked about business cycles, and we talked about like a recession, and we said, hey, in a recession, the economy is still growing. It's just not growing as fast as it was before. And again, we'll look at the data here in just a second, and we kind of saw those downward slopes in our real GDP growth rate, that were still positive. The economy was still bigger. Disinflation is effectively the same thing. Prices are still going up, just not as much as they had been before. So while deflation is relatively uncommon, disinflation happens all the time. Prices are going up, just not as rapidly. They're still going up though. So that's kind of what disinflation is. So I want to give me a second here to put down the screen and turn the lights off. So I went to the Federal Reserve site. It's going to take just a second. It should come up pretty quickly. There we go. I went to the Federal Reserve site, and again, I'm using the CPI because I think that's just the most relevant to you guys as students. And I've pulled up, this is prices using the CPI since 1947, 48, something like that. And no shock, prices have gone up over time. I think this is, we all have expected this. So what I did is I applied our CPI inflation rate formula, the one right over here on the board. I applied it to all of the values in this chart. I did annualize it, so remember like before how we would go in and edit our graph and make it annual. I did that just to make it a little bit smoother and easier to see. And if I go to the next tab, here we have annualized inflation rates. So this is the consumer price index again, but now I'm using percent change from prior year. So we'll have our annualized inflation rates. And just like what we saw with our real GDP graph, this dark bar right there is 0%. You'll notice almost the entirety of the graph is above 0%. Mathematically, it has to be. If we are saying prices have always gone up, well then we have to have some kind of positive inflation rate. You can see a few of the deflation periods. Way back here, right, in 1948, and right here in 1956. Yeah, it kind of fell below that line just a little bit. And then maybe right here, you can maybe barely see this one. This is 2009. So this was our Great Recession in 2009, and we definitely saw prices fall below that bar. We had deflation. So what caused it? We had two major components of consumer spending that fell like a stone. One we've kind of talked about, just a minute ago, gas prices. Gas prices in 2007 and 8 were real high. Some parts of the country, Chicago, Los Angeles, like California, they were over $4 a gallon. And even here in St. Louis, we were around $3 a gallon. So prices were really high. As we get to the end of the Great Recession in 2009, kind of 2010 range, gas prices had come back down to around, in St. Louis, actually just under that $2 mark. Not quite as low as they are today, but just under that $2 mark. And in other places around the country, they were under $3. So that's a 25% drop or more in the price of gas, something that consumers buy a lot of. We also saw the housing market collapse in 2008. And again, if this is kind of a basket of what consumers spend their money on, housing is going to be in that basket. For me, that might be a mortgage. For you, that might be an apartment or whatever. But what we saw is that because home prices fell so dramatically during that time, it was enough to actually bring prices overall in society down to the point where we had deflation. So it got that negative value. We got close in 2015 here. You can see it's right on there, but it was positive. It was like positive 0.1%. So it was pretty close as an annual rate, but there were actually several months, if we looked at it as a monthly rate in 2015, that were below. And we've kind of been hovering right around this 2.5%. This mark here, you probably can't see this line. Right there is 2.5%. We've kind of been hovering around there. That's actually the inflation rate goal. Starting in the really kind of the 80s, you'll notice the 70s, we had real high inflation in the teens. And then kind of around in the 1980s, we really started changing our goals towards the inflation rate. And we kind of came up with this idea of between 1 and 3%. And for the most part, if this is 2.5 and this is 5, the separation in my fingers here, for the most part, we've either been in that range or below it. So, we're not really seeing much creeping up to that 5%. We're kind of staying in that between 1 and 3% for the most part. The reason that is the goal is first of all, we like it because it's predictable. We like being able to know what price changes are going to be. Now, some people might say, well, wait, why would the goal be like, 2, 3, whatever percent we're picking in that range? Why not 0? First of all, we don't think 0 is possible. As long as population is going to keep growing, which it has, you're going to have more buyers, which means that more people are going to start bidding up that price. So we don't think that 0 is even possible. We think with more people, more population, you're automatically going to see prices rise. We also can factor in some other things like wages. There is a pretty good link between wages and inflation. So if we are seeing wages go up, which kind of we like as society, I think, well, that means that's an expense for firms that they have to cover. So they have to raise their price to cover that. So we don't really think that 0 is a good idea. It's probably not possible with demanders. And if we had 0 inflation, that would mean no one's wage ever would, really change, or we wouldn't want wage change. Well, we do. We want some wage growth, and we do notice that people are continuously joining the market, so we kind of know there's going to be some inflation. So what was going on here in the 70s? Where did we get this like 14%? And again, if you look at it in monthly, you're going to have some months in the 70s that are even higher. This was the oil shocks, the OPEC oil shocks. So in the early 70s, mid 70s, Israel and Egypt, well, they were not really getting along very well. I don't necessarily know if much has changed in that regard. The United States and Israel are allies, and so the United States was backing Israel in a war between the two countries. And the fallout of that was that the OPEC producing nations who were more allied with Egypt said, okay, well, we're going to cut gas. We're not going to ship gas to the United States and the Western allies, so England, Germany, etc. And so all of a sudden, they reduced the amount of gas that was coming from their countries to the Western world, which caused a huge jack-up in gas prices in the 70s, which means that not only were you paying more for gas in your car, but companies were paying more to transport goods to the market, and they had to raise their prices to make up for that. So just kind of an interesting little take on that. Okay, so that's kind of a good look at the data. That's probably a good place to stop what is class 1, I think, over 3 videos. So that's where we'll pick up tomorrow for you guys, or in 5 seconds if you just click the next video.